Now we're off to Chapter 13 of our adventure in California studies. It's all about building the Central Pacific Railroad. So California was now a state in the United States, the 31st state. All of that tumult during the gold rush left a legacy of social unorganization, you might say. But there is governance going on, and now, of course, the big idea was to connect the United States with rails from sea to shining sea. In early California, of course, transport by water was a whole lot easier than land with all the rivers and the delta, the Pacific Ocean, and so on. Steamboats, paddle boats dominated the bay and river traffic. And here you see a steamboat. It appears to be called the Yosemite, docking in Sacramento in the early days, in the 1860s or 1870s or so. On land, the California Stage Company had service covering about 1,500 miles of routes. By 1857, Congress passed the Overland California Mail Act. The Overland Mail Company of New York was awarded the contract for delivering mail. They had a 2,800-mile route, which guaranteed a 24-day service. How about that, between San Francisco and the Mississippi River? That was a big deal in those days. Now, for years, ever since grade school, you've heard of the Pony Express. And for all the legend that surrounds the Pony Express, it only operated for 18 months, and it was put out of business by the first Transcontinental telegraph line in October of 1861. So that was certainly a revolution in communication, the telegraph line. Now, there's been talk of a transcontinental railroad to this point, especially during the 1850s, because already some small railroads had been built on the eastern seaboard. There was some squabbling over the route, of course, because at this time the country was quite divisive over the issue of slavery. So there was a debate as to whether the route for said railroad would be in the northern part of the United States or the southern part. And that sort of caused a stalemate in Congress with respect to acting. Gee, a stalemate in Congress, you think? Anyway, along came this fellow by the name of Theodore Judah, who was an engineer. He built the Niagara Gorge Railroad in New York. The promoters of the Sacramento Valley Railroad, a new company that had just started, brought him to California. And Judah was able to engineer and build the line from Sacramento to Folsom in 1854. Now, if you know Northern California like I do, I was born and raised in Sacramento. If you go to Sacramento today and you go to downtown Sacramento and you take the light rail system, the Gold Line that goes all the way out to Folsom, that Gold Line route essentially follows Folsom Boulevard, which essentially follows the same grade and route that Judah built in 1854 when he made that railroad from Sacramento to Folsom, which was specifically designed to get the gold miners to the gold fields in the foothills of the western Sierra Nevada faster. He was sent to Washington, D.C. to present the idea to Congress of a transcontinental railroad and also to other people who were powerful at the time. But the sectional differences between North and South prevailed in the shadow of the Civil War about to start. Judah engineered and found a viable route through the northern Sierra Nevada by way of a gold mining town called Dutch Flat, and then higher up from there, Emigrant Gap, and then higher up from there, Donner Pass. This is essentially the route that Interstate 80 follows today. Judah appealed to big business people, merchants in San Francisco for financing, but it fell on deaf ears. These merchants were not interested in doing anything altruistic. They wanted to make money. Then he changed his strategy and appealed to 4 Sacramento businessmen whose names may sound familiar to you, but at the end of this chapter, they certainly will. Leland Stanford, does that ring a bell? Collis P. Huntington, as in Huntington Boulevard in Fresno, as in Huntington Beach in Southern California. Charles Crocker, who was in the hardware business, but he also owned a bank later on. And then Mark Hopkins, in downtown San Francisco on Nob Hill, there is the Mark Hopkins Hotel. Stanford, Huntington, Crocker, and Hopkins. These 4 associates, as they called themselves, were tentatively interested in Judah's plan for a transcontinental railroad. The initial meeting between the associates, or the Big Four as they are often called, took place in a room over the hardware store that was owned by Huntington and Hopkins. I mistakenly said that Crocker was in the hardware business. He was in the banking business initially. He was actually, it was actually Hopkins and Huntington that were in the hardware business. Now, you can go to Old Sacramento today and see a replica of said hardware store that has been built. It really doesn't look like the original one did, but it's close enough for tourist purposes, right? The Central Pacific Railroad of California was formally incorporated then on June 28, 1861, in the anticipation that Congress would soon approve this project and subsidize it in light of the fact that the Civil War just broke out a few months earlier. So there you see a photograph, courtesy the California State Railroad Museum Foundation and the state parks. By the way, if you've never been to Old Sacramento, but if you have and have never visited, you need to go to the California State Railroad Museum. You can be in there for hours. It is a most fascinating museum with actual old moving stock and Pullman cars and old engines and so on. It's fascinating. I highly recommend that as a prospective teacher in California schools, you need to go to this railroad museum and take a tour of it. Judah's contributions to this idea were tremendous, but not in the financial sense. He had the savvy and the know-how engineering-wise. He didn't realize, though, to what extent he was losing control of his own enterprise. Judah went to the U.S. Congress to secure federal support for the Transcontinental Railroad project. He was made clerk of key railroad committees in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Now, let me tell you something. Today, that would constitute a major conflict of interest. Now, if you think there's conflict of interest in government today, the fact that Judah, who wanted to push for this railroad and get government subsidies for building said railroad, was made the key clerk in railroad committees for both the House and the Senate. If you don't think that's conflict of interest, then I don't know what conflict of interest is. Let me tell you something. This is far surpassing anything that would be allowed today. So the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 was signed by President Lincoln on July 1st of that year. This act was amended 2 years later to reflect terms that would be a lot more generous to the railroad. So here we had two railroad companies. You had the Central Pacific Railroad Company, a California corporation that was charged with the task of building a railroad eastward from Sacramento through the Sierra Nevada over to the Great Basin, and the Union Pacific, a corporation that was chartered by Congress, that would build the railroad westward from Omaha, Nebraska, and somewhere they would meet in the middle. The federal government provided extensive loans and land grants to both companies, and here are the terms of some of these loans. If these companies were building rail on flat grounds, the loan would be $16,000 a mile. If the railroad companies were building through the Sierra Nevada or the Rockies, it would be $48,000 a mile for a federal loan because, of course, that's much rougher terrain. And then in the Great Basin, basically between the Sierra Nevada and the Rockies, they would get a loan of $32,000 per mile. So that was quite a generous set of loans for both railroad companies. In 1863, Stanford induced the state of California to further subsidies to the Central Pacific Railroad. Now remember, he was one of the big four that formed this company, and he was also president of the railroad. So there's another example of incredible conflict of interest. When a vacancy occurred in the state Supreme Court here in California, Stanford, who was then governor by now, appointed Edwin B. Crocker, Charles Crocker's brother, to the unexpired term in the state Supreme Court. Edwin was also the legal counsel for the Central Pacific Railroad, and he did not resign from that position while serving as a state justice. So let me tell you, conflict of interest was just rampant in early California. There, of course, is a picture of Leland Stanford. The costs of building the railroad were heavy. The conflicts then developed between Judah and the Big Four that would separate these two groups, Judah and his interests, and the Big Four and their interests. Judah was a lot more interested in constructing a great railroad. His motives seemed to be more altruistic. The Big Four were a lot more interested in maximizing their profits. Judah then broke with the Big Four and got $100,000 from the Big Four for his involvement in the railroad. He traveled to the East Coast to secure another $300,000 to try to buy the Big Four out. But unfortunately, Judah died in New York on November 2nd, 1863, after coming down with yellow fever en route to the East Coast when he was going through Panama. Now, the Big Four, getting back to them, with the help of state geologist Josiah Whitney, for the person for whom I believe Mount Whitney was named for, Whitney and the Big Four maintained that the Sierra Nevada, the big mountain range to the east of the valley, began 7 miles northeast of Sacramento. I want to tell you, this is relatively flat ground, which is not even 100 feet above sea level. This convinced Congress to grant the $48,000 per mile loan for this area, even though the Big Four's tactics were deceptive and even though this was essentially flat land. The Big Four never erected a monument in Judah's honor. It was a Society of Engineers that did that in 1930. Can you believe that? So these people declared that the Sierra Nevada started in relatively flat land northeast of downtown Sacramento at a place called Arcade Creek. And here's a picture of Arcade Creek today. You don't see any big mountains there, do you? So these men literally moved mountains. By 1865, revenue was coming into the Central Pacific from federal, state, and county subsidies, as well as from freight charges from customers who were shipping goods and riding the rails on completed sections of track. Now they had a shortage of labor. Stanford openly detested Asians coming to California in his address to the state when he was, inaugurated as governor in 1862. And in spite of that, he endorsed an experiment with 50 Chinese laborers, which ended up being successful. And then Chinese laborers from China were actively recruited to come across the Pacific to help build this railroad. At the peak of construction, the CPRR employed 10,000 Chinese laborers. The working conditions were harsh. These guys were suspended on ropes from the precipice of cliffs, hammering with chisels and hammers to dig tunnels. It was rough conditions. The Chinese workers went on a strike in the spring of 1867, demanding higher wages. Crocker, who owned a dummy company that was constructing the railroad, cut off their food supply and threatened to discharge them. The strike was over in 1 week. The main tunnel took a year to drill through the Sierra Nevada near Donner Summit, and it was done entirely by hand, if you can imagine that. Close to completion of the railroad, a race ensued between the Irish-American workers of the Union Pacific Railroad, who were building westward from Omaha, and the Chinese workers of the Central Pacific. And by then, both of these companies were in northern Utah. The Chinese workers laid 10 miles of track in 1 day, which is a record that still stands to this day. And you can see the sign. You can see a replica of that sign in the Railroad Museum in Sacramento, by the way. Each company was building its track furiously, trying to get subsidies for every mile they were building. They wanted the money. But Congress had yet to designate a meeting point for these two railroads. Promontory Point, Utah was designated finally as the meeting point. And you can see the map that I have on there, courtesy of pbs.org, showing Promontory Point, which is north of the Great Salt Lake, where the two railroads were supposed to meet. The meeting of the UPRR and the CPRR took place at Promontory Point, Utah on May 19th, 1869, a century after the first Spanish settlement in Alta California. So that was quite an amazing feat, where finally iron rails united the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States.